I knew something was wrong the moment my son locked the refrigerator. Not childproof. Not one of those cheap plastic latches meant to keep toddlers out. This was a real metal padlock, thick and heavy, the kind people use on storage units or abandoned barns. He snapped it shut while I stood 3 feet away, holding my empty teacup. "Mom, it's just temporary," Caleb said without looking at me. His voice had that rehearsed calm people use when they've already decided you don't deserve an explanation. "Groceries are expensive. We need to control portions." Control portions. I was 68 years old, not a raccoon digging through garbage. Behind him, my daughter-in-law, Lila, leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone. She didn't even pretend to care. She wore that same tight smile she'd had since the day they convinced me to move into their house outside Phoenix 3 months earlier. "It's for your own good," she added lightly. "You've gained weight since retiring." I hadn't gained weight. I had lost 10 pounds since moving in. But I didn't argue, because arguing had never helped, and because something deeper than humiliation had already started tightening inside my chest, a quiet, creeping dread that whispered this wasn't about groceries at all. It started the week after my pension deposit arrived. I had worked for 37 years as an operations manager at a regional insurance company called Brightstone Mutual. I'd earned every dollar of that retirement fund. It wasn't extravagant, but it was steady. Enough to live comfortably. Enough to never depend on anyone. Or so I thought. "Mom, you don't need to handle finances anymore," Caleb had told me during Thanksgiving dinner last year. "You should relax. Let me help." He had said it with such warmth, such concern. And I wanted to believe him, because after my husband Robert died 8 years ago, Caleb was all I had left. So I signed the forms. I gave him joint access to my retirement account. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was being loved. The first time they limited my food, I told myself it was temporary. The second time, I noticed something strange. They never ate leftovers. Only I did. Every meal they served me came on a smaller plate than theirs. Scraps, cold pieces, half portions. Sometimes food that had clearly been sitting for hours. Lila called it portion management. I called it humiliation. But I said nothing until the night I woke up thirsty. It was past midnight. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioner. My throat burned, so I walked quietly to the kitchen. That's when I saw it. Lila and Caleb standing near the dining table, counting cash. Stacks of it. Thick bundles held together with rubber bands. I froze in the hallway shadows. "I told you she wouldn't notice," Lila whispered. "She trusts me," Caleb replied. Then he laughed softly. The sound sliced through me like glass. "How much is left in her retirement account?" Lila asked. Caleb flipped through a notebook. "Almost nothing now," he said. "We moved most of it into the new investment property under our names." My legs nearly gave out. Not almost nothing. Everything. They had taken everything. My stomach turned cold. I should have stepped out, confronted them, screamed. Instead, I stayed frozen, listening as they casually planned what to do with the money I had spent a lifetime earning. That's when Lila said something that changed everything. "Good," she murmured. "Once the transfer is fully cleared, we can start looking at assisted living options for her." A long pause. Then she added quietly, "The cheap ones." I pressed my hand over my mouth to stop the sound rising in my throat. Because in that moment, I understood something devastating. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't stress. This wasn't misunderstanding. My son and his wife were slowly erasing me, and I had no idea how far they were willing to go until the next morning, when Caleb handed me a single dry sandwich and said, "Mom, from now on, you get 2 meals a day. Doctor's orders." I had never been to any doctor, and as he walked away, I noticed something else, something that made my heart start pounding with a new, terrifying realization. He was carrying my late husband's safe deposit key, the one I had hidden for years, the one he should never have known existed. And suddenly, I knew. They weren't done taking from me. They were just getting started. I didn't sleep that night, not because of hunger, but because of memory. I kept seeing my son as a boy, 6 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while I packed his school lunches. He used to hug me from behind while I washed dishes, his arms barely reaching around my waist. "You're the best mom in the world," he would say. I wondered when that boy disappeared, or if he had ever truly existed. Morning came, with the sound of Lila's heels clicking across the hardwood floor. She knocked once before opening my bedroom door. "No waiting, no permission. We need to talk," she said. Her tone was polite, but cold, like a bank officer discussing loan terms. Caleb stood behind her, holding a folder. My stomach tightened. They sat across from me, as if conducting a business meeting, which in a way they were. Mom, Caleb began avoiding my eyes. "We think it's time to simplify things." He slid the folder onto my lap. Inside were documents, legal documents. I recognized enough to understand the gist immediately. Power of attorney, property transfer forms, a will revision draft. My hands started trembling. "You want me to sign this?" I whispered. "It's for your protection," Lila replied smoothly. "If anything happens, we can manage your assets." Assets? What assets? They had already drained my retirement. Then Caleb said something that made my skin go cold. "There's also the house in Sedona." My breath caught. He shouldn't have known about that. That house had been purchased decades earlier by Robert's parents, technically under a family trust that I was sole beneficiary of after Robert passed. I had never told Caleb, never told anyone. "How did you—" "You left paperwork in your old filing box," he interrupted quickly. That was a lie. I never kept those documents at home. They were locked in a bank safe deposit box, the same key I had seen in his hand last night, which meant only one thing. He had searched through my private belongings, without permission, without shame. Mom, Caleb continued, his voice tightening slightly. "We just want to make sure everything stays within the family." Within the family, as if I wasn't part of it. I closed the folder slowly. "I need time," I said. Lila's eyes flickered, a flash of irritation. Then she smiled again. "Of course, but not too long," she replied. "Legal processes take time." That was when I noticed something else, a detail small enough to miss, but impossible to ignore once seen. Her purse sat open on the chair beside her. Inside was a thick envelope, stamped with the logo of a law firm, Henderson, Pike and Rowe. I knew that firm. They specialized in estate litigation, inheritance disputes, contested wills. My heart began pounding, because that meant they weren't just planning to take my assets. They were already preparing for a legal battle against me. After they left, I sat alone for a long time. Not crying, not panicking, just thinking. For the first time in months, a strange clarity settled over me. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't confused. And I wasn't finished, because Caleb had made one fatal mistake. He believed I was weak. He believed age meant ignorance. He believed hunger meant surrender. But he had forgotten something critical. For 37 years, I had managed crisis operations for an insurance company. I had handled fraud investigations, corporate sabotage, multi-million-dollar disputes. I knew exactly how manipulation worked. And more importantly, I knew exactly how to document it. Slowly, I reached into the lining of my old handbag and pulled out the tiny voice recorder I had started carrying 3 weeks earlier. The moment I first suspected something was wrong, the red light blinked steadily, recording everything, including their entire conversation this morning. And as I pressed stop, a calm, cold certainty settled inside me. They thought they were starving me into submission. They thought they were taking everything from me. They had no idea. They were actually handing me the evidence that would destroy them. But the real turning point came later that afternoon, when I overheard Lila on the phone, laughing and saying words that would ignite a revenge I never imagined myself capable of. She won't last another year, she said casually. Then she lowered her voice and added, and once she's gone, the mansion becomes ours. She won't last another year. The words echoed inside my skull long after Lila ended the call. I was standing in the hallway, outside the laundry room, when she said it, holding a basket of folded towels I no longer had the strength to carry. My hands trembled so badly, the towels slid to the floor. I didn't pick them up. I just stood there in the shadow of the doorway, breathing slowly, forcing my heart to calm down. Because in that moment, something inside me shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but it hardened. It became something colder, something sharper, a clarity I hadn't felt since the last major fraud investigation I handled at Brightstone Mutual nearly a decade earlier. Back then, I learned one unshakable truth. The most dangerous predators are not the loud ones. They are the quiet ones who smile while they plan your disappearance. And now, I understood something else. Caleb and Lila weren't just stealing my money. They were preparing for my death. Not by violence, but by neglect. Slowly, legally, quietly, I forced myself to breathe evenly and returned to my bedroom without making a sound. Then I locked the door. It was the first time I had ever locked a door in my own child's house. The click of the bolt sounded louder than a gunshot. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my old leather notebook, the one I used during my years managing corporate crises. Inside were columns of dates, times, details, everything I had been documenting since the first strange incident 3 weeks ago. Food restrictions, financial transfers, verbal statements, changes in their behavior, patterns. I had trained myself decades earlier to record facts, not emotions. Facts win cases, emotions get dismissed. My hand moved steadily across the page as I added a new entry. Lila phone call, mentioned timeline 1 year, reference to mansion transfer after death. Then I paused because something else clicked into place. The mansion. They weren't talking about the Sedona property. They were talking about something much bigger. The estate in Colorado, Robert's family estate, the one I had kept secret from nearly everyone for 40 years. Only 3 people knew about it. Robert, his father, and the family lawyer. No one else, not even Caleb, or so I believed. My chest tightened, which meant there was only one explanation. Someone had told them, or someone had accessed information they should never have been able to find. I stood abruptly, ignoring the dizziness that followed. There was one place I needed to check. The small metal lockbox hidden beneath the false bottom of my suitcase. I pulled it out and opened it carefully. Inside were only a few items. Robert's wedding ring, a faded photograph of us from 1978, and a sealed envelope containing the contact information for Harold Whitmore, the family attorney who had managed the Colorado Estate Trust for decades. I hadn't spoken to him in years because I never needed to. Until now, my hands shook slightly as I held the envelope. Not from fear, from something else. Relief. Because for the first time since discovering their betrayal, I realized something critical. I wasn't alone. There was someone who knew the truth. Someone who could confirm everything. And someone who could help me protect what remained. But as I reached for my phone, another thought stopped me cold. If Caleb and Lila had already accessed information about the estate, that meant they might already be planning legal action, which meant time was no longer on my side. I needed to move carefully, quietly, strategically, just like I had taught younger investigators years ago. Document first, confirm second, strike last. I slipped the envelope back into the lockbox and closed it. Because before contacting anyone, there was one more thing I needed. Proof, not suspicion, not theory, proof of intent. And as if the universe had been waiting for that exact thought, I heard something outside my bedroom door. A whisper, Caleb's voice, low, tense. I told you we shouldn't rush this, he murmured. Lila's reply came sharp and cold. We don't have time to be gentle, she said. The lawyer wants everything finalized before Christmas. A pause. Then the words that made my blood run cold. If she refuses to sign, Lila continued quietly, we moved to Plan B. Silence followed. Heavy, unsettling. Then, Caleb asked in a strained voice, and if Plan B fails? Lila didn't hesitate. Then we let nature take its course. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Because in that moment, I understood something terrifying. They weren't just planning to erase me financially. They were preparing to eliminate me completely. And suddenly, I knew. This was no longer about survival. This was about war. The next morning, I ate the stale toast they left on my tray without complaint. I chewed slowly, deliberately, even though every bite tasted like cardboard. Because I had learned something important in my decades of corporate crisis management. Never let your enemy know when you've stopped being afraid. And I was no longer afraid. I was focused. Caleb barely spoke to me that day. He avoided eye contact while scrolling through his phone at the dining table. Lila, however, watched me constantly, like a predator, assessing whether its prey was weakening. You seem quiet today, she said lightly as she cleared dishes. I'm tired, I replied calmly. That part wasn't a lie, but not for the reason she assumed. I had spent the entire night reviewing my options. Every asset, every connection, every legal protection still available to me. And most importantly, every vulnerability they didn't realize they had exposed. Because the more I thought about it, the more one detail refused to make sense. They were acting too confident, too certain that they already controlled everything, which meant they believed something that wasn't true. They believed the estate transfer would be automatic once I died. But that was impossible, because Robert's father had built a very specific clause into the family trust, a clause almost no one knew about. Not even Robert fully understood its implications. I remembered the exact day his father explained it to me. We had been sitting on the porch of the Colorado mansion years before Caleb was born. The mountains were glowing orange in the sunset. He had looked at me very seriously and said, "This property can never belong to someone who betrays family." At the time, I thought it was just sentimental wording. But later, when I reviewed the legal documents, I realized how literal he meant it. The trust contained a morality clause. If any beneficiary was proven guilty of financial exploitation or abuse toward another family member, they would be permanently excluded from inheritance rights. Excluded. The word echoed in my mind now like a quiet thunder, which meant something extraordinary. If I could legally prove what Caleb and Lila were doing, they wouldn't just fail to inherit, they would lose everything connected to the estate forever, including the investment property they had secretly purchased using my stolen retirement funds. Because that transaction created a direct legal trail, a trail that could connect financial abuse to inheritance disqualification. My pulse quickened. For the first time since their betrayal began, hope flared inside me. Not emotional hope, strategic hope, the kind built on facts and law. But there was still one missing piece. I needed confirmation from someone with authority, someone who could verify the trust clause still stood legally enforceable. And there was only one person who could do that. Harold Whitmore, Robert's family lawyer. I waited until afternoon, when Caleb left for work and Lila went to her weekly fitness class. Then I locked my bedroom door, sat on the edge of the bed, and dialed the number written inside the sealed envelope. It rang 3 times. 4. Then a deep, calm voice answered. Whitmore Law Offices. My throat tightened unexpectedly, not from fear, from the overwhelming weight of everything I had been carrying alone. This is Margaret Ellis, I said quietly. I need to speak with Mr. Whitmore. There was a brief pause. Then the receptionist's tone shifted. 1 moment, please. Seconds later, another voice came on the line. Older, steady, familiar. Margaret, he said softly, is everything all right? And in that moment, hearing someone who knew my past, Who knew Robert? Who knew the truth of our family history? Something inside me finally broke. Not into tears, but into resolve. No, I replied calmly. Everything is not all right. I took a slow breath. Then I said the words that would begin the war they never saw coming. I believe my son is trying to steal my inheritance. Silence followed, heavy, measured. Then Harold Whitmore spoke again, his voice now sharp and alert. "Margaret," he said carefully, "if that's true, you need to listen very closely." A pause. Then the sentence that changed everything. "Because 3 weeks ago, someone already tried to access your estate records." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Someone tried to access my estate records," I repeated slowly. "Yes," Harold Whitmore said, his voice calm but firm. "They contacted our office claiming to represent you. They requested verification documents related to the Colorado Trust." My fingers tightened around the phone. "When was this?" I asked. 3 weeks ago," he replied. "We refused the request because they could not provide the required authentication code." 3 weeks. The exact week Caleb first insisted on helping with my finances. The same week my retirement account access changed. The timeline snapped together with frightening clarity. "Did they give a name?" I asked. There was a pause. "Yes," Harold said quietly. "They identified themselves as Caleb Ellis." Hearing my son's name spoken in that context felt like being struck across the chest. Not because I was surprised, but because it made everything undeniably real. No misunderstanding, no mistake. This was deliberate, calculated, planned. "I see," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. Margaret, Harold continued gently. "I need to ask you something directly. Are you safe right now?" The question hit harder than anything else, because it acknowledged something I hadn't fully allowed myself to admit. I wasn't just being exploited. I was being endangered. "I'm alive," I answered carefully, "but I am being financially controlled and neglected." A long silence followed. Then Harold's tone shifted completely. Professional, sharp, protective. "Then we need to act immediately," he said. "First, I want you to understand something very important." He paused, as if choosing his words with precision. "Your son cannot access the estate. Not now. Not ever. Because the trust contains a protective clause that activates under suspicion of coercion or abuse." My heart began pounding. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," Harold said slowly, "that if we document credible evidence that you are being exploited financially or physically, Caleb will be permanently excluded from inheritance rights." Excluded. The word echoed again, heavier now. "And there's more," Harold added. I sat up straighter. "The clause doesn't just disqualify him," he continued. "It automatically transfers your entire estate into a protected charitable foundation until a new, qualified heir is legally designated." My breath caught, which meant something extraordinary. If Caleb was excluded, he wouldn't just lose access. He would lose everything permanently. Margaret, Harold said gently, "You need to tell me exactly what is happening in that house." And for the first time I did. I told him about the locked refrigerator, the restricted meals, the drained retirement account, the pressure to sign documents, the overheard conversations, and finally, the threat disguised as casual cruelty. "She said I wouldn't last another year," I whispered. Harold didn't speak for several seconds. When he did, his voice carried quiet anger. "That constitutes elder abuse," he said. "Financial exploitation and neglect." The words felt strange, clinical, legal, yet profoundly validating, because they named what I had been living. "You have already done the right thing by documenting everything," he continued. "But we need stronger evidence, recorded statements, financial records, witness corroboration." "I have recordings," I said quietly. Another pause. Then his tone sharpened further. "Good," he said. "Then listen carefully." He outlined a plan, precise, methodical, legal. We would gather irrefutable proof of coercion and financial abuse. We would freeze any remaining financial transfers. And most importantly, we would wait, because timing would determine everything. You must not confront them yet, Harold warned. If they suspect legal action, they may try to force you into signing documents quickly. I understood. Predators become most dangerous when they feel cornered. There is one more thing, Harold added. Yes, he hesitated. Then said quietly, Margaret, Caleb's attempt to access your estate wasn't the only red flag. My stomach tightened. What else? He submitted forged medical documentation, Harold said. My blood ran cold. Medical documentation. Yes, he replied. Papers claiming you suffer from cognitive decline. The room spun, because now I understood their full strategy. They weren't just planning to take my assets. They were preparing to declare me legally incompetent, to erase my voice entirely. Margaret Harold said softly, This is far more serious than inheritance manipulation. A pause. Then he spoke the words that ignited a fire inside me. This is an attempt to legally erase you while you are still alive. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, the last remnants of hesitation were gone. Then we stopped them, I said calmly. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something powerful rise inside my chest. Not fear, not grief, justice. But neither Harold nor I realized how quickly that plan would be tested. Because that evening, Caleb came home holding a new set of documents. And this time, he wasn't asking me to sign. Caleb didn't sit down when he entered my room that evening. He stood in the doorway, holding a thin manila envelope. His jaw was tight. His eyes avoided mine. That alone told me everything. Something had changed. Mom, he said flatly, we need to handle this tonight. No warmth, no pretense, just urgency. Lila stood behind him, arms folded, watching me with open impatience. I kept my voice calm. What is it? Caleb stepped forward and handed me the envelope. Inside were legal documents, but not the same ones from before. These were different, more aggressive, more final. Guardianship petition forms, medical authorization statements, and a draft affidavit claiming I was no longer mentally capable of managing my own affairs. I felt a slow, cold wave move through my body. They weren't waiting anymore. They were escalating. You're filing for legal guardianship, I said quietly. It's for your safety, Lila replied immediately. Her tone carried that same rehearsed sweetness. But this time, she didn't bother hiding the edge beneath it. You forget things, she added. You get confused. I do not, I said calmly. Caleb finally met my eyes. For the first time in months, I saw something raw there. Not guilt, fear. Mom, please, he said. This will make everything easier. Easier? For whom? You've already taken my retirement, I said softly. Now, you want to take my legal voice, too. Lila's expression hardened. This conversation is not productive, she said sharply. You need professional care. Professional care. The phrase echoed ominously. Because now, I understood. Guardianship would allow them to place me anywhere. A facility. A low-quality assisted living center. A place where I would have no access to finances, legal representation, or communication. Where I would disappear quietly. And legally. Caleb stepped closer. His voice dropped. Mom, if you don't sign voluntarily, the court will decide. A threat, disguised as concern. I looked at him carefully. At the man I once carried inside me for 9 months. The boy I once protected from every danger. And I felt something settle inside my chest. Not hatred, something colder. Final. You should leave, I said quietly. Both of them froze. What Lila snapped. You heard me, I replied. Leave my room. For a moment, silence filled the air. Then Caleb's face hardened. You're making a mistake, he said. No, I answered calmly. You already did. His eyes narrowed. Then he did something that revealed more than any argument could have. He reached forward and took the pen from my nightstand, not offering it, holding it out. Demanding. Sign, he said. Just one word. No more pretending. No more politeness. The room felt suddenly very small, very still. I met his gaze, and slowly I smiled. a small, quiet smile. Because at that exact moment, I knew something he didn't. The entire conversation had just been recorded. Every threat, every coercive statement, every piece of proof Harold Whitmore said we needed. "Caleb," I said gently, "do you remember what you told me when you were 8 years old?" He blinked confused. "What?" "You said," I continued softly, "that honesty always protects people in the end." He stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. But I wasn't speaking to him anymore. I was speaking to the future, to the moment when truth would finally surface. And as they left my room in anger, slamming the door behind them, I reached into my handbag, pulled out the recorder, and pressed stop. The red light went dark, but something inside me burned brighter than ever. Because now I had what they never thought I would obtain. Proof of intent, proof of coercion, proof of abuse. And with that proof, their entire plan was about to collapse. They just didn't know it yet. And neither did I realize how quickly karma would begin to move. Because the very next morning, someone unexpected knocked on the front door. The knock came at 9:23 in the morning. Not the soft, hesitant tap of a delivery driver. Not the quick double knock of a neighbor. It was firm, official, the kind of knock that carries authority before a single word is spoken. I was sitting at the small desk in my bedroom, reviewing my notes, when I heard it. My hand froze over the page. Downstairs, I heard Lila's heels crossing the tile floor quickly. Then the front door opened. A man's voice followed, calm, measured. "Good morning. I'm looking for Margaret Ellis." Silence. Then Lila's tone sharpened immediately. "Who are you?" "My name is Daniel Pierce," the man replied. "I'm a case investigator with Adult Protective Services." My heart skipped. APS. Harold Whitmore had mentioned the possibility of involving them, but he had said it would take time. Weeks possibly, not days. Certainly not this fast. Which meant only one thing. Someone had already filed a report. Downstairs, Lila's voice shifted again, now falsely warm. "Oh, there must be some misunderstanding," she said lightly. "My mother-in-law is perfectly fine." "I'm sure we can clarify that," the investigator replied, calmly. "I just need to speak with her directly." A long pause followed. Then Lila said tightly, "She's resting." "I'll wait," he answered. Silence again. Then I heard Caleb's voice entering the hallway. "What's going on?" Lila whispered something urgently. Footsteps approached. Then another knock. This time at my bedroom door. Sharp. Controlled. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood the moment's importance. This was the turning point. The first official witness. The first external set of eyes on what had been happening behind closed doors. I stood slowly and walked to the door. Then I opened it. Caleb and Lila stood there, both smiling too tightly. "There's someone here to see you," Caleb said. "Probably a mistake." "I'll handle it," I replied calmly. I walked past them. Neither touched me, but both watched me closely, as if trying to predict what I would say, as if trying to control the outcome. Too late. Because the moment I stepped into the living room, I saw him. Daniel Pierce stood near the entryway, holding a leather folder. He was in his late 40s, with observant eyes and a posture that radiated quiet authority. But what struck me most was his expression. When he looked at me, it changed instantly, from neutral professionalism to concern. Real concern. He noticed everything in seconds. My weight loss, the frailty in my posture, the tension in the room behind me. "Mrs. Ellis?" he asked gently. "Yes," I replied. He nodded. "I received a report regarding possible elder neglect and financial exploitation," he said calmly. "I need to ask you a few questions privately." Behind me, Lila spoke quickly. "There's no need for that," she said. "We can all talk together." Daniel Pierce didn't even look at her. "That won't be necessary," he said firmly. "Mrs. Ellis has the right to speak confidentially." The authority in his tone was unmistakable, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt protected. He gestured toward the dining table. "May we sit?" I nodded. We sat across from each other. Caleb and Lila remained standing in the hallway, watching, listening. Daniel Pierce opened his folder, but before he asked a single question, he said something quietly that stunned me. "You're not the one who reported this," he said. My brow furrowed. "No," he nodded. "The report came from a financial institution," he explained. "Your retirement account flagged unusual transfer activity consistent with exploitation patterns." My chest tightened. So the bank had noticed, even after everything. The report included documentation, he continued, and a note indicating the account holder might be under coercion. A note. My mind raced. Then I remembered. 2 weeks ago, before I fully understood what was happening, I had sent a brief message through the bank's secure portal. A simple line. "I may be under financial pressure. Please monitor my account activity." I had almost forgotten about it, but they hadn't. Daniel Pierce looked at me steadily. "Mrs. Ellis," he said gently, "are you being forced to sign legal documents or give up control of your finances?" I held his gaze, and for the first time, I said the truth aloud to someone outside this house. "Yes." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Behind me, Caleb's voice exploded. "That's not true." Daniel Pierce didn't react. He simply continued writing. Then he asked quietly, "Are you being denied adequate food?" My throat tightened, but I answered clearly, "Yes." Silence followed, heavy, final, and in that moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted completely. Because this was no longer a family dispute. This was an official investigation. But what Caleb and Lila didn't realize yet was that this investigation would trigger something far more devastating than they ever imagined. Because Daniel Pierce closed his folder, looked directly at Caleb, and said, "I'll need copies of all financial transactions you've conducted on Mrs. Ellis's behalf." Caleb's face drained of color. It happened in an instant. The confidence he'd carried for months vanished, like a shadow pulled away from light. "That's private financial information," he said quickly. "It belongs to Mrs. Ellis," Daniel Pierce replied calmly, "and she has authorized review." He looked at me for confirmation. I nodded. Lila stepped forward, her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "We've done nothing wrong. We've taken care of her." Daniel Pierce finally turned toward her. His expression didn't change, but his voice hardened slightly. "Then the documentation will reflect that," he said. He stood slowly. "I'll also need to conduct a living condition assessment," he continued. "Kitchen access medication management, nutritional availability." Kitchen access. The words hit like a quiet thunder, because there was still a padlock on the refrigerator. And for the first time, Lila realized the significance of that detail. Her eyes flickered toward Caleb. A silent panic passed between them. "It's broken," Caleb said quickly. "The lock is temporary." Daniel Pierce simply nodded. "Then it won't be an issue to demonstrate access," he replied. He walked toward the kitchen without waiting for permission. Caleb hesitated only a second before following. Lila stayed frozen in place, her breathing shallow, her composure cracking for the first time since this began. I watched her quietly and saw something new in her eyes. Not arrogance, not calculation. Fear, real fear, because she understood something critical. This was no longer under her control. Moments later, a metallic clink echoed from the kitchen. Then silence. Then Daniel Pierce's voice, calm, cold. "Why is there a commercial-grade padlock on this refrigerator?" No one answered immediately. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice shook. "It's temporary." Daniel Pierce didn't respond, but I could hear the shift in the air, the irreversible shift. Because some evidence doesn't need explanation. It speaks for itself. Minutes later, they returned to the living room. Daniel Pierce's posture had changed. More rigid, more formal. He closed his folder. Based on initial observations, he said evenly, "I am filing an immediate protective report." The words hit like a verdict. "What does that mean?" Caleb asked weakly. "It means," Daniel replied calmly, "that Mrs. Ellis is now considered at risk." He turned to me. "Temporary protective measures will be initiated," he continued, including financial review and welfare monitoring. Lila's voice rose sharply. You can't do that. Daniel Pierce met her gaze. Yes, he said quietly. I can. A long silence filled the room. Then he added the sentence that changed everything. And until this investigation concludes, neither of you may restrict Mrs. Ellis's access to food communication or financial records. The power in the room shifted completely. For the first time, they were the ones being watched, being evaluated, being judged. Daniel Pierce handed me a small card. My direct number, he said softly. Call immediately if you feel unsafe. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, because relief flooded me so suddenly, it felt almost overwhelming. But as he walked toward the door, he paused. Then he turned back. There's one more thing, he said carefully. He looked directly at Caleb. Attempting to obtain guardianship through false medical claims constitutes criminal fraud. Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't, because the truth had already begun to close in around him. The door closed. Silence followed, heavy, explosive. Then, Lila turned on Caleb in a furious whisper. You said everything was handled. Caleb's voice cracked. I thought it was. They didn't notice me standing there, watching, listening, for the first time in months, not as a victim, but as someone who finally held the advantage. And as they argued, in rising panic, I felt something settle inside my chest, a quiet certainty, because the first domino had fallen, and they still had no idea. The worst consequences were yet to come, especially when the financial investigation uncovered something neither of them expected, something that would not just destroy their plan, but destroy their entire future. The house changed after the investigation began, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in small, telling ways that revealed everything. The padlock disappeared from the refrigerator that same afternoon. No one mentioned it. Caleb stopped speaking to me entirely. He moved through the house like a stranger, avoiding eye contact in an elevator, his presence tense, brittle. Lila, however, became quieter in a different way. More controlled, more watchful, like someone calculating damage after realizing a plan has failed. But the biggest shift wasn't inside the house. It was inside me. For months, I had lived in a fog of exhaustion and fear. Now that fog was gone, replaced by something sharp, clarity, strategy, and a deep, steady calm. Because I knew something they didn't. The investigation would not stop at food access or welfare checks. It would lead directly to the money. And the money told the real story. 3 days after Daniel Pierce's visit, my phone rang in the late morning. It was Harold Whitmore. Margaret, he said without greeting his voice, tight with urgency, the financial audit has begun. My pulse quickened. What did they find? He exhaled slowly. Exactly what we suspected, he said. But worse. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. How much, I asked quietly. All of it, he replied. The words felt like ice sliding through my chest. They transferred your entire retirement fund over a period of 6 weeks, he continued. Layered transactions, multiple shell accounts, then consolidated into a real estate purchase, the investment property, the one I overheard them discussing. But here's the critical part, Harold said, his tone sharpening. The transaction records show your electronic signature authorization was altered. I frowned. Altered? Yes, he said. Not forged exactly. Modified. He paused, as if someone accessed your account credentials directly and changed permission settings without your knowledge, which meant something devastating. Caleb hadn't just persuaded me to give access. He had manipulated my account behind my back. That constitutes financial fraud, Harold said quietly. Criminal level. The word criminal hung heavy in the air, because now the situation had crossed a line. This was no longer just elder exploitation. This was prosecutable. And then Harold added something that made my breath catch. The investigation also uncovered attempted transfers from the Colorado Estate Trust. My heart pounded. What? Yes, he said. They submitted falsified documentation claiming you had authorized early asset liquidation. I closed my eyes, The scale of their deception felt staggering. They failed. Of course, he continued. But the attempt alone activates the exclusion clause. The exclusion clause. The words carried enormous weight now. Margaret Harold said carefully, based on the evidence already collected, Caleb Ellis has legally disqualified himself from inheritance rights. A long silence followed, because even though I had expected this outcome, hearing it confirmed felt surreal. He's excluded, I whispered. Yes, Harold replied. Permanently. I sat very still, processing, not with triumph, but with a quiet, aching finality. Because this was the moment a mother accepts something irreversible. My son had chosen his path, and that path no longer included me. There's more, Harold added. My stomach tightened. What else? The investment property purchased with your stolen funds, he said. It is now subject to seizure. Seizure. They're going to lose it, he continued calmly, along with any assets tied to the fraudulent transfers, which meant something even more devastating for them. Everything they had built using my money would disappear, and Margaret Harold said gently, there will likely be criminal charges. I didn't respond immediately, because despite everything, a small part of me still struggled with the reality. Criminal charges against my own child. Do you want to proceed? Harold asked softly. The question wasn't legal. It was personal, moral, final. I stared at the photograph of Robert on my nightstand, his steady eyes, his quiet strength. And I remembered something he once told me during a difficult time early in our marriage. Justice isn't revenge, he had said. It's truth refusing to stay hidden. I took a slow breath. Then I answered, yes, not because I wanted to punish Caleb, but because I refused to disappear quietly. Refused to let their cruelty become my ending. But as the legal machinery began to move, neither Harold nor I realized how quickly karma would strike in a way no court could control. Because that very evening, I overheard a conversation that revealed the first cracks in Caleb and Lila's alliance. And it changed everything. It happened after midnight. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioner. I woke thirsty and walked quietly toward the kitchen. Halfway down the hallway, I heard voices from the living room. Sharp, angry, Caleb and Lila. Arguing? I stopped in the shadows. Why didn't you tell me? It could turn into a criminal investigation, Caleb demanded. His voice trembled with panic. I didn't think it would, Lila snapped back. You said she wouldn't fight back. I didn't think she had anything left, he shouted. The desperation in his tone cut through me like a blade. Because now he understood. He hadn't just failed. He had destroyed his own future. Lila's voice dropped cold. You're the one who rushed the transfers, she said. You panicked when the bank asked questions. You told me to move everything before Christmas, he shot back. A long silence followed. Then Caleb asked quietly, what if they press charges? Lila didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something chilling. We protect ourselves. My stomach tightened. How Caleb asked. Another pause. Then she said words that made my blood run cold. We say she authorized everything. My hand pressed against the wall to steady myself. We say she's mentally unstable, Lila continued. That she's confused. That she doesn't remember signing. Caleb's voice shook. That's lying. That's survival, she replied sharply. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Then Caleb whispered, what if they don't believe us? Lila's answer came quiet, calculated. Then we prove she's incompetent. My heart pounded, because now I understood. They weren't just trying to defend themselves. They were preparing to attack. Legally, desperately. And then Lila said the sentence that changed everything. If she's declared unfit before the case moves forward, she murmured her testimony becomes unreliable. The strategy was ruthless. If they could discredit me, they could weaken the entire investigation. Caleb didn't respond for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded hollow. I never wanted it to go this far. Lila's tone softened slightly. It's already this far, she said. Now we finish it. Finish it. The words echoed like a warning. I stepped back silently, returned to my bedroom, and closed the door with shaking hands. Because in that moment, I realized the war wasn't over. It was escalating. But as fear threatened to rise again, I remembered something Harold had told me earlier that day. They are running out of options. Desperate people make mistakes. I sat on the edge of the bed, breathed slowly, and reached for my recorder, because tonight's argument had just given me something powerful. Proof of intent to commit perjury. Proof of conspiracy. Proof that they knew exactly what they had done. And as I pressed stop, a strange calm settled over me, because I understood something with complete clarity now. This was no longer about revenge. This was about truth. And truth had already begun to close in around them. What I didn't know yet was that the next morning would bring a confrontation so explosive it would shatter whatever remained of the family we once were, and force Caleb to finally face the consequences of everything he had done. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. It was just after 8 in the morning when Caleb knocked on my bedroom door. Not the aggressive pounding from before, not the forced politeness either. This time, the knock was uneven, hesitant, almost afraid. I opened the door slowly. He stood there alone. Lila was nowhere in sight. His face looked older somehow, the skin beneath his eyes dark, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. "Mom," he said quietly. For the first time in months, his voice sounded like it used to, soft, uncertain, human. "I need to talk to you." I stepped aside and let him in. He sat on the chair near the window, staring at his hands. For several seconds, he didn't speak. The silence between us felt heavy, with everything that had happened, everything that could never be undone. Finally, he whispered, "They're freezing our accounts." I didn't respond. He swallowed hard. "The investment property? It's under investigation. They said it was purchased with fraudulent funds." His voice cracked slightly. I didn't think it would happen this fast. That was the first true statement he had made in months, because reality had finally caught up with him. "And Lila?" I asked quietly. He closed his eyes. "She left last night." A strange stillness settled in the room. "Left," I repeated. He nodded slowly. "She packed her things after we got the legal notice," he said. "Said she won't go down with me." The words carried a quiet devastation. Not because I felt sympathy for Lila, but because Caleb was finally facing the truth. He had never been her partner. He had been her tool. "She says I made the mistakes," he continued hollowly, "that everything was my responsibility." I looked at him carefully, and for the first time since this began, I saw something raw in his eyes. Not anger, not entitlement. Shame, real shame. "I never thought she'd leave," he whispered. A long silence followed. Then he said something that made my chest tighten painfully. "I didn't realize how far we'd gone until she walked out." The words hung in the air, because they revealed something tragic. He hadn't stopped because he understood it was wrong. He stopped because he was alone, and that realization hurt more than anything else. "Mom," he said softly, "I know I can't fix this." He looked up at me. Tears filled his eyes. "But I need you to know, I never wanted to hurt you like this." The sentence pierced straight through me, because part of me still remembered the boy he used to be. But another part, the part shaped by months of neglect, humiliation, and betrayal, remained steady. "I believe you didn't start out wanting to hurt me," I said calmly. His face crumpled slightly. "But you chose it anyway," I continued. He nodded slowly. "I did." The honesty in that moment felt heavier than any courtroom testimony. "I don't expect forgiveness," he whispered. "I know," I replied quietly. Another long silence filled the room. Then he asked the question he had been afraid to say. "Are you going to let them press charges?" The air between us seemed to hold its breath. I thought of everything: the locked refrigerator, the stolen retirement, the forged medical claims, the plan to erase me legally. And I answered with calm clarity. "Yes." The word landed softly, but it carried absolute finality. Caleb closed his eyes. A single tear slid down his cheek. He didn't argue, didn't plead, because he understood. Justice had already begun. He stood slowly, walked toward the door, then paused. Without turning around, he said in a broken voice, "I wish I had remembered sooner that you were never weak." Then he left, and as the door closed behind him, I felt something shift inside me. Not victory, not relief, but something quieter. Release, because the truth had finally surfaced, and nothing more needed to be said. 3 months later, I stood on the wide stone porch of the Colorado mansion. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. The mountains stretched endlessly, beyond the horizon, glowing gold under the late afternoon sun. I had not been here in years, not since Robert passed. For a long time, the estate felt too heavy with memory, too full of ghosts. But now, standing there again, it felt different. Lighter, like a place no longer defined by loss, but by survival. The legal process had moved swiftly after the evidence was finalized. Caleb accepted a plea agreement. Financial fraud, elder exploitation. He avoided prison, but the consequences were permanent. His professional licenses were revoked, his financial records monitored, his inheritance rights legally terminated, excluded. The word that once sounded abstract now carried a quiet, unshakable finality. The investment property was seized, the funds recovered as much as possible, and the estate trust remained intact, protected, as Robert's father had always intended. As for Lila, she disappeared quickly after the investigation intensified. Her name now appeared only in legal documents, a footnote in a story she once tried to control. I walked slowly along the porch, running my hand along the smooth wooden railing. Inside the mansion, renovation work had begun, not to restore its former grandeur, but to transform its purpose. The trust had activated its secondary clause. Part of the estate would now fund a foundation dedicated to protecting vulnerable seniors from financial exploitation. A quiet form of karma, not revenge, justice, a way to ensure that what happened to me would not happen to others. I paused at the edge of the steps and looked out over the valley. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace, not because everything had turned out perfectly, but because I had refused to disappear, refused to be erased, refused to let betrayal define my ending. The phone in my pocket buzzed softly. It was a message from Harold Whitmore. The foundation registration is complete. The Ellis Protection Initiative is officially established. I smiled gently, not out of pride, but out of something deeper. Purpose, because even after everything, life had not ended. It had transformed. I turned back towards the house, toward the future waiting inside. And before stepping through the door, I thought about something important. If you are listening to this story right now, if you have ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or betrayed by the very people who should have protected you, remember this: age is not weakness, kindness is not ignorance, and silence does not mean surrender. Sometimes justice moves slowly, but when truth finally rises, it changes everything. If this story moved, you share your thoughts in the comments. Let others know they are not alone. And if you believe in stories where karma finds its way back to those who deserve it, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because there are many more stories still waiting to be told. And sometimes hearing them is the first step toward reclaiming your own voice.